Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. This webinar is a part of the Conservation Center for Art and Historic Artifacts Regional Heritage Stewardship Program. This program is an initiative funded through the National Endowment for the Humanities, pursued in close partnership with the Utah Division of Arts and Museums and Utah Humanities. The RHSP program is an initiative focused on bringing preservation education and resources to the Intermountain West region of the United States. We want to thank Utah Division of Archives and Records Service for partnering with us today for our Caring for Archives webinar. And now I will pass it off to Alan, the local government archivist at the Utah Division of Archives and Records Services.
Okay, hello everyone. This is Alan Barnett, and as Leah said, I'm a local government archivist with the Utah State Archives. I worked at the State Archives for about 18 years now, worked in records management, worked in reference for quite a few years, and now I'm involved in our program to work with local governments to care for and preserve their historic records. As part of my role there, I'm involved with the State Historical Records Advisory Board, or SHRAB, for the state as a sort of consultant. And the SHRAB does a re-grant program where we provide grants to various cultural heritage institutions to help them preserve their historical records they may have. And what we found in our grant program that a lot of institutions would come to us who had expertise in maybe in museum curation or in library science or some other kind of background, and they're sort of flummoxed by how to handle the archival materials they had, and it made it difficult for them to come up with a good project proposal and whatnot. So we began a program of doing training to give people who don't have the exposure to archives management some basic fundamental training, and that's what this comes out of. Although this is a very much condensed version. So the purpose of the presentation today for me is to introduce you to very basic care and management of archival materials. Very broad overview. We're not going to get into a lot of details. This is aimed specifically at staff and institutions that may have another primary purpose or primary goal for their institution, but that hold archival materials as a secondary function, and also to some non-professional or semi-professional smaller institutions that may not have the professional archival background. So we're hoping to help them too. So this could include museums, public libraries, local historical societies, a whole variety of things. So to start off, I want to send out a poll and just take a couple of minutes and hear what kind of institutions you're from and get an idea of who we're talking to, because I know we've got quite a bit of variety, I think, in our audience today. So let's just take a couple of minutes. If you'll just respond to this, and this will give us an idea of who all is here participating. Okay. I think you can all see the results. Gives sort of an idea of sort of where everybody falls. I guess I'm not surprised. It's sort of what I expected this this group to be today. So, but you can see we've got quite a bit of variety in who's here. But I'm assuming that all of you have some interest in and some need for dealing with archival materials and are trying to maybe get a little help in knowing how to approach that. Okay. All right, so let's continue on. Okay, first of all, let's talk a little bit about what are archival materials. And this is a little bit hard to define, but this is the way that I like to define it. Archival materials are things that are created for the primary purpose of recording or relaying information, regardless of whatever format. Usually when we think of archival materials, we think of words on paper, letters or documents, but it can also be voice recordings on tape, music recordings, images on film. There's a whole variety of ways that we can record information. And there are sometimes things that maybe artifacts have their own kind of information that they convey, but that's not their primary purpose. So, for instance, you may have a rocking chair in your museum, and you can certainly gather some information from that about maybe the social status of the people who originally owned that or whatnot. But that rocking chair was not created for the primary purpose of it conveying that information. It was created as a piece of furniture. So so that's the first thing about archival materials, is that they are typically created for the express purpose of conveying information. Okay, there are also materials that are rare or unique. So in your library, you may have thousands and thousands of books, but they're books that were published in large print runs. There are a lot of them out there, and they're not going to be in your archive. They are going to be just out in the general stacks. It's only going to be the rare or unique books that are going to be in your special collections or archives. Okay, and then these are things that have been evaluated to have a value in documenting the past. So that's the way that I think of archival materials, and how you might think about, well, among all the things we have, what would we consider to be archival materials, and what might we consider to be just part of our book collection or part of our artifact collection. This is, I think, is a helpful way to think through that. Okay, then I want to just talk about some definitions here. In the archival world, we talk about collections, and especially if you're not used to it, it gets confusing. And so I want to clarify that when we talk about collections, we may be talking about a couple of different things. First of all, there's the individual collection. That's a set of related items coming from a common source and created or accumulated through a particular activity. So this may be, a collection may be a set of records that was donated by a particular individual or particular organization. They all come from the activities of the entity that donated them, and that is an individual collection. Then when your institution then gets a whole group of these kind of individual collections, that becomes your institutional collection. It's a grouping of these individual collections that's held by your museum or your archive and used collectively to tell a broader story, a story that your institution is committed to telling. So when we talk about collection, sometimes we are talking about your institutional collection, the whole collection of all the individual collections you have, or sometimes we may be talking about the individual collections. And most of what we talk about today will focus on individual collections. Okay, now let's talk about what is an archive. The term archive can be used in a number of different ways as well. First of all, it can be a body or collection of historical records from a single source. That's sort of the individual collection. So I could have, let's say I have a collection of records, historical records from the Ladies Literary Society that was donated to my institution. And that can be an archive of the Ladies Literary Society. So we can use it in that sense. It can also be an assemblage of related historical record collections. So here in Utah, for example, the University of Utah has a ski archive where they have assembled these individual collections from various sources, all relating to skiing, the history of skiing in Utah and the Intermountain West. So that's an example of an archive that's an assemblage of various individual collections, and we would call that an archive as well. And then we also refer to the place or the institution that holds those historical records as an archive. And sometimes it could be that your institution has some other primary role as a museum or as a public library or as an academic library, but then that you have a certain portion of your institution that is referred to as the archive, where you hold the historical records. Okay, so then if you hold archival materials, you are then in the position of being an archive. Question is, what is your role? The role of an archive is to collect records of historical value, to identify the records, and perhaps actively solicit donations or purchase historical items based on what story it is that your institution is trying to tell. Then once you've collected archival materials, you then take on the role of preserving those records for the future. And then the third and important part of that is that we then, as archives, make the records available for research. If there's no point in collecting and preserving these records unless they are made available. For most of it, it's going to be making the records available to the public. It might be scholars, it might be the general public. Sometimes for corporate or institutional archives, the primary users might be internal users within the organization, but it's all about making these materials available so that the information they can contain can be used. Okay, I'm not going to, when I do a longer, more extensive training on this, I get into how to determine what you should be collecting. Here, all I'm going to talk about is just this one slide. Determining what to collect involves appraisal, which is an evaluation of the historical value of materials that you may have the opportunity to acquire, and then your collection scope, which is where you have defined for your institution what it is, what story you want to tell, and what kind of materials, subject-wise, and it may be subject-wise, it may be geographical boundaries, certain time period, that sort of thing, and that becomes your collection scope, and that determines what story you're going to tell and what sort of things that you are going to collect and take into your archival collections. So that's all I'm going to talk about, what to collect, but I think that's an important piece that we have to look at. Okay, now I want to get into some basic archival principles. And here I want to emphasize the archives profession has its own set of principles and practices based on the unique nature of archival materials. So all of us come to our professions with a certain expertise, a certain background. So you may have a background as a historian, a librarian, a museum curator. I actually got my my academic training in historic preservation, as in architecture, and that can all be helpful to us in working with archival materials. But we need to set aside the practices that are designed for other materials in favor of those practices designed for archives when we're working with archival materials. So even though I have a background in historic preservation that has helped inform and help me make sense of archival practice, I have had to learn through other training about how to handle archives, because archival materials have special needs and particular standards. So this is sort of my warning that as we work with archival materials, we may have to take off our other hats that we wear and put on our archivist hat to approach these, because they're going to be approached in a little bit different way than some of the other work that we do. Okay, the most basic archival principle is what has been termed in the archival world in French, respect des fonds, in my very best French, which I translate as respect the collection. And sometimes when I talk about this, I think people get a little bit confused. They say, well, of course we respect the collection. It's a great collection and we take care of it, and we share it with people. But the idea of respect des fonds is that we are not just respecting the items in the collections, we are respecting the collection, and in this case I'm talking about an individual collection. We respect that collection as an entity, as its own entity that has its own character and its own sort of internal connections. So I use the example here of this crazy quilt, which of course crazy quilts are always really fantastic. This is one held by the Utah State Historical Society. And you can see it is this conglomeration of all these different things, and if you zoom in on it, you see a variety of different things. You see a beehive, which is the state symbol for Utah. You see a little depiction of the first log cabin in Utah. You see a horseshoe. You see the Mormon temple. There's all these different symbols on here, all put together in this sort of beautiful jumble. And this is a case where the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. And I could take this apart, and I might have a little piece of fabric that with a little bit of embroidery that would be lovely, and but the crazy quilt itself is great because of all the parts coming together. And so respecting this quilt as its own thing with its own identity that is more than just all the little pieces that are put together is what I think this respect for the collection is treating that the unique identity that all these pieces create together. So that's an underlying principle underlying a lot of what we do in archives. Okay, related to that idea of respecting the collection are two other fundamental principles, which sometimes we call the twin pillars of archives. One is provenance, which I usually say provenance, but I believe it's correct to say provenance or provenance, so whichever you prefer, and original order. Provenance is the idea that of maintaining the history of a collection with its connection to its origins and its creators, so that we know where this came from, where a collection, the materials in a collection came from, and who created them, why they were created. So, for instance, if I have a letter, knowing who created it, under what circumstances, and maybe sort of its journey over time and how it ended up in my collection will all help inform me on the meaning and the context for that particular letter. Original order is about maintaining the organization of a collection as it was used by the creator of the records. The way that the creator used the records and organized them will also help us understand the relationships between the various items in a collection, and give us insight that that we wouldn't otherwise have about the way that they were used and what the creator intended with them, what they maybe meant to the creator. Some cases we get materials where there isn't a clear organization, and so sometimes we will apply an organization to materials in an archival collection that will reflect how the records were created and how they were used as best we can. I'm going to give an example from my own life on original order. This is a scrapbook that belonged to my great-grandmother that I have inherited, and you can see it's got a whole variety of things that my grandmother pasted in here. A lot of photographs, but a few postcards, and some people's inclination, and I know my inclination sometimes is like, well, okay, let's get this organized. Let's sort this out. There's a picture at the top of my great-grandfather standing in front of the house. There's a couple of postcards from my great-grandfather when he was on trips, and pictures of my grandmother and her sister. Well, it would be easy to say, well, let's take this all apart and let's sort this out. We can put all the postcards together, and we can put the pictures of my great-grandfather, we'll put all the pictures of him together and sort them out by pictures, who the people are in the pictures. And sometimes this is sort of an impulse, especially I see with photographs, of like sorting things out. Once I do that, I then lose the context of how my grandmother had organized my great-grandmother had organized these items, and the way she saw them and the relationships between them. And in fact, that has happened in part with this. When I got this scrapbook from my grandmother, the binding had come apart, and so the pages had all fallen out. So I cannot tell what order these pages were in, and so I have lost some context. There might be some information. I can't tell if they were arranged chronologically or if they're some kind of subject where she's put friends together or different outings together. I can't tell that because it's all out of order now, so I've lost some information there. So that's just an example of how maintaining original order can help us hold on to some information that would otherwise be lost in our archival materials. Okay, so the bottom line with respecting the collection, with maintaining the provenance of a collection, maintaining original order, is that it provides context. It provides extra information that we would otherwise lose if we didn't maintain those things in our collection. And that context can add considerable richness to the collections that we have and to the information that is available to us in those collections. Okay, so I want to switch now to talking about processing collections. Processing collections is what we do in the archival world and to promote both the preservation and accessibility of the collections that we have. And there are two aspects of processing. One is physical control of the collection, and the second is intellectual control, and I'm going to talk about each of those. Physical control is getting a handle on the actual materials in the collection. It involves organizing materials and housing them safely. Okay, when we're talking about organizing, here again we come back to original order, maintaining the organization that the original creator used, or applying an organization that reflects how the records were created and used. Okay, just some quick examples. We can look at things and say, well, how would we expect things to be organized? So for these examples of PTA scrapbooks, if somebody donated the PTA scrapbooks to us, to our institution, we would probably expect those to be arranged chronologically by school year. We may have a separate scrapbook for each school year, or maybe a separate section in each scrapbook for each school year. And that's sort of what you might expect in a PTA scrapbook. Irrigation company meeting minutes, we'd expect those probably to be arranged chronologically by the date of the meeting. If somebody donated a set of letters between a soldier and his wife from World War I, those might be arranged a number of different ways, and we want to look at them carefully. First of all, you might have them separated. You'd have all the letters the soldier sent home to his wife, and they would probably be all in chronological order. And then you'd have another set of letters that the wife sent to her husband on the front, and those might be in chronological order, and they would be two separate sets of letters. But then you might also have a set of letters where someone, presumably the original creators, merge those two so that you have the letter from the soldier and then the response from the wife, and you have that back and forth. And it just depends on how the original creators of those chose to organize those over time. Business correspondence could be arranged in a lot of ways, and it just depends on how the business chose to do that. And you'd have to look at records. If you receive some business correspondence, you'd have to look at how that business chose to do their correspondence. Sometimes it could be arranged as strictly chronological by when the correspondence was received and responded to. Sometimes it might be arranged by subject, or sometimes it might be arranged by correspondent, by who the business is corresponding with. So it just depends on how they choose to do that. And if I got a collection of business correspondence donated to my institution, I would want to look at that and sort of ferret out how they had chosen to organize that, because that will help us understand how they did their business. Family photos could be arranged a lot of ways. A lot of times they're just in a shoebox and they're just a mess, and we're left to organize them ourselves. But in that case, oftentimes, if we think about how were these created, well, typically a family photo collection is created over time, so it will be chronological. And one of the most important things in a family collection is that often it'll be created generationally. So there will be layers generation by generation. That becomes part of the organization of those records. So that's just some examples of how we might think through organization of various records that come to us and become part of our collection, our institutional collection. Okay, the other part of getting physical control, once we figured out organization, is to house our records safely. And the purpose of housing is to protect the records, providing a protective envelope around those records, and to help keep that order that we have put in place so that things don't get mixed up, and we know where to find things. And there's a whole variety of archival folders, boxes, and sleeves that you can purchase, and they come in a variety of different sizes to handle things from letter-sized documents to handling videotapes or handling large ledger books. You can get, there's a whole variety of different sizes and shapes, and these all help us to provide that protective enclosure that holds things together in order. Okay, so that's the other part of getting physical control. The next thing is getting intellectual control. And intellectual control is about knowing what records you have and knowing where they are. So it's sort of the knowledge part of it. And the primary thing that we do in archives to gain intellectual control of a collection is to create what we call a finding aid. Finding aid is a general term that can apply to a lot of things, but the most basic kind of finding aid is a document that describes the materials in a particular individual collection. And depending on your institution, various institutions will use different terms. So some institutions will use the term collection register. Here at the Utah State Archives, we call ours inventories. Sometimes they're called guides. So it's an institutional decision what term you want to use, but they're all the same thing. And it's a document that places the materials in context, the materials in the collection in a context, by pulling together the basic information about the collection in one place. And it provides a summary information that helps both you who are staffing your institution and managing these collections, and also for users, for researchers, to help them identify where they're going to find materials that will be helpful for them in their research. Okay, a finding aid should include what are required by DAX, which is an archival standard describing archives, a content standard. That's what DAX stands for. But this is the professional standard, and these are the most basic elements that should be included in your finding aid. You should have the name and location of your repository, so the whatever museum and the address and city, the title of the collection, what the collection is named, which is oftentimes maybe the title, the name of the institution or the entity that created the records, the person, the date range of what time period those records cover, the extent, which is how much stuff there is, and that's often measured in cubic feet, or sometimes in linear feet, sometimes in number of boxes. And that also is an institutional thing, how you determine how you want to express the intent or the volume, how much stuff you have. The name of the creator of those materials, or creators if it's multiple creators. Then a basic description of what the collection contains, what kind of materials, maybe some background about who it was that created them, and the process that whether it was a career in politics or a business that created them, sort of the process that brought this collection into existence. Conditions governing access, which would be if you have any restrictions. Sometimes people may donate a collection with the idea that it would be restricted for a certain amount of time until anybody who was mentioned in the records was long dead, to protect privacy or whatnot. Or sometimes there may be some particular access conditions. You may need a particular kind of equipment to play a recording that you have in a collection. And so those are that kind of thing you would want to note that, well, in order to get access to this, you're going to need a cassette player, which you can't get ready access to these days like we used to be able to. Okay, and then language and scripts. You want to note if there's any unusual or non-English languages or scripts. So that could be maybe you have a diary in Swedish, or maybe you have some records that were done in shorthand. Okay, I want to add two additional ones. Those are the ones that I just gave you are required by DAX, the archival standard. These are the other two that I would recommend that you do. They're not required by the standard, but they are highly recommended. One is processing notes, which means that you document what you did so that someone who comes along down the road knows what you did, whether you did some repairs to the collection, some cleaning, whether the records were in disarray and you imposed some kind of arrangement, then you want to explain what your reasoning was. Whether you separated out some materials because they were fragile and needed special storage, that kind of thing. You're going to want to explain for the future you, or for the people who follow after you, to understand what it is you did and why you did it. And then a box inventory, which goes through box by box and lists the basic contents of the collection, so that a researcher can quickly browse through that and say, oh yeah, this is going to be something that's going to be useful for me to look at, or no, this actually isn't going to have the kind of thing that I'm looking for. Okay, I want to do a quick little discussion of legacy collections, because what I found in working with almost any institution that has archival materials is that most of us have stuff that came to us before we really had figured out how to handle archival materials. And that's even true for professional archives like the Utah State Archives, that we have stuff that came to us decades ago before some of these archival principles were well established. And so we have these things for which we have no provenance and the original orders lost. So what do we do with those? So I would recommend that we separate out and reconnect anything where we can figure out what the provenance and original order is. So if I can tell that sometimes I run across records that are a mess and not identified where they came from, but by sorting through them, I can figure out, oh, these all came together, they're all part of a group. I can reconstitute that set of records and figure out what that order would have been. So sometimes I'm able to do that. Otherwise, the things that I can't reconnect, I can sometimes just treat as a legacy collection and say, this is our collection that we acquired prior to such and such a time, and we don't have the provenance of exactly where it came from. We don't know what the original order was, and we explain that all to the researcher so that they know that what they're looking at is a bunch of stuff that may still have a lot of value, but for which we can't really give much background. Okay, and then we would follow the same steps for establishing physical and intellectual control of those records as we would something that had just come in the door. Okay, final point that I want to talk about is access. We mentioned earlier all this work that we do to collect, preserve, inventory, rehouse, all of that we're doing is sort of for naught if we're not providing access so that people can use these materials. So creating finding aids that provide summaries of these collections that we hold is one of the primary ways to make them more accessible, so someone doesn't have to go through the whole collection themselves to figure out what it's all about. We have done some of that legwork for them, and that will help them narrow down what will be useful to them. Putting information online, so if you have a website for your institution, if you can put information that these are the various collections that we have, maybe putting your finding aids, those documents online, so that people who don't walk through the door in your institution can get an idea of what you have and figure out whether it's worth their time to travel to your institution to look at it. Some institutions are able to digitize parts of their archival collections. Maybe they have a collection of great photographs or a great collection of letters or whatever, and decide there's enough interest out there that we're going to digitize this and put this online. And that we see that increasingly where researchers are able to get a lot of information from digital collections that are put online. And sometimes you can get grant funding for that. That's one of the things that our SHRAB does here in Utah is that we provide grants to digitize materials from collections so they can be made available online. But then you also want to make accommodations for in-person researchers to come in and actually look at your materials. And that may be setting aside a little workspace. It probably will include creating some sort of procedures and policies around how those are handled, and educating staff members on how to provide access, how to find things, how to make sure that the records in your collections are kept safe while they're being used by researchers, so they don't get damaged, so no one walks off with them, that sort of thing. So it requires a certain amount of setting up maybe some policies, some procedures for how to handle that, and doing some training with your staff. Okay, that was a quick overview of archives that I had for you today. I'm hoping that was helpful. We have now time for some questions, and so you can submit your questions, and I will go through and I will read the questions that we received and then try to give the best answer I can. So go ahead and submit questions. I'm scanning through the questions that have been submitted so far and seeing what we need to address. Okay, so someone asks, intellectual control, you do not mean copyright here, right? And I'm saying yes, I'm not talking about copyright. Copyright is a completely different, that's a whole different training to talk about copyright. Intellectual control is just about understanding, knowing what you have in a collection and being able to communicate that to other people. So yeah, it is not, this is not about intellectual copyright. It's just about internal control of knowing what you have. Okay, a question for the end of the program. Will we be able to access the slides later? My understanding is that these will be made available on YouTube, this presentation. And so you could go back, listen again, or if there was someone else in your institution or maybe another colleague who you think might benefit from this, you could refer them to that. And I think maybe Leah, you could address that when we're done with the questions here about people accessing that YouTube resource. Any book and resource suggestions? The Society of American Archivists has of course, that's the business they're in, so they have quite a good collection of materials on basic archival theory and practice. I would suggest maybe going there to the SAA website and looking at their bookstore. If you wanted to email me, I could look in my library and give you probably give you a few titles of things that I found particularly helpful. So off the top of my head, I don't feel prepared to give you my best recommendation, but I'd be happy to do that after I browsed my library and thought about what the most helpful materials have been for me. Okay, regarding digitizing photographs, do you have recommendations for navigating copyright issues? Oh boy, here again, this is a whole different training, and I'm not really an expert on copyright. Photographs are tricky. I think a lot of academic institutions deal with this in digitizing photographs. I guess the short answer is no. I don't feel like I'm really qualified to give you a whole lot of advice, except for future reference, when you get photographs or other materials from a donor, you should always get them to sign over whatever rights they have to those materials. So, because then that will help clarify that you have what rights you have as an institution to use those materials. Photographs, generally, if they're older photographs, will be out of copyright. But if they're more recent, then it does get trickier. If you're getting them from the photographer, then you can get the photographer to sign over rights. Otherwise, I think you're going to need to go to some other sources that are going to be able to give you better advice on that. So I'm sorry I can't be more helpful on that one. Okay, someone asked, what about assigning names and numbers to items in the collection? I'm not sure exactly what you're getting at here with this question. If you're talking about items in the collection, usually when we are inventorying an individual collection, we will use descriptive terminologies just to describe the item. So we might just describe it as correspondence from person A to person B, this date range or whatever, and that would be all the description we would do. We don't number things. One of the things often, it's pretty standard museum practice to give an accession number to each artifact in the collection, and and often paint that number on the artifact to keep track of those things. That is not archival practice. We will treat the collection, the entire individual collection, as an item with an inventory that lists more specifics about what's in that, but we don't go through and assign an accession number to everything in that item. You might have an accession number for the collection as a whole. Okay, I hope that's helpful with that. With the current pandemic, what is the best way to quarantine or sterilize archival materials? I don't want to get into that too heavily. One of the best ways that I've heard is just to set materials aside that have been used and set them aside for a period of time. And I don't know what the recommendation is. I don't know that anybody knows for sure, but for a number of days to before they are again handled by someone else. And I think that generally is sufficient. Someone mentions that blogging about collections is another way to promote collections, which is a really good comment. That's a good way to get the word out about what you have and help people get access to it, help people know that it's there to be used. Can you point us toward a resource for basic preservation efforts, such as handling newsprint or slide photographs? Here again, if you will send me an email, I will tell you some of the things that I have seen that address those particular things, but I can't pull that out of off the top of my head. What are you doing in protecting the collection during the COVID-19 pandemic? Our research center, our public research center, is closed to the public because of the pandemic. And so we are handling we're handling most of our research requests by email. And so people will send in their questions, and then we will look things up for them, we'll scan things, send them copies. Occasionally, we've had people who have need to look through large amounts of materials and aren't really clear on exactly what they're looking for until they see it. And so we're doing occasional research by appointment, and we require people to wear masks when they come into the building, and we put them in a space where they are isolated so that we can have social distancing. We use Past Perfect, but the lexicon in that program is not really right for the collections we have. How can I add better terms to work for us? I just want to note, a lot of you who are working in museums are working with Past Perfect, and Past Perfect, the reason it's used so widely is because it's such an effective tool for museums, and it does have functionality for archival materials, but it's not as good with the archival materials. I would suggest that you talk with somebody who's an expert in Past Perfect. Because I'm an archivist, I don't use Past Perfect, so I'm not really qualified. So I'm sorry I can't help on that one, but I just want to point out that is something that a lot of you are probably grappling with. Someone says, thought you would put that information about copyright and restricted access in the finding aid. And that is true. Part about that, you would want to put that. It's not something that I think about much because we have mostly government records, and so we have very little copyrighted materials in our collection. But that's true. You would want to put that in your finding aid if there are copyright restrictions on materials in the collection. Someone asked, I'm curious about what tools are being used for online public access. Our museum is searching for a budget-friendly tool for collections management that can publish online directly from the database. I think there's a number of things out there. I am not involved in that part of our operation. We publish our digital assets on the Mountain West Digital Library, which uses Content DM. Sometimes partnering, and in the case of here in Utah, there are a number of different institutions that smaller institutions can partner with. So because we are a government archive, government entities that want to digitize materials and put them online can partner with us, and we can post them online. Or the University of Utah, Southern Utah University, a number of different universities around the state partner with smaller institutions to get things online. So that's one way to do it, but that's about all I can give you on that one. How do you handle multiple copies of materials within a collection, especially if space is very limited? There is something that's called weeding in collections. If you have multiple copies of the same thing, sometimes you might have like an original and then a multitude of photocopies or whatever. You can weed things. You say there's no need to have multiple copies of this thing. Or if it's something published, oftentimes I'll say, well, I'm going to keep 2 of these, and the rest of these I'm going to maybe find another home for, that sort of thing. So okay, we are just about out of time. I'm looking to see if there's anything that we haven't really hit on, or that I think maybe I could actually give something helpful on. How would you approach organizing a collection comprised of newspaper articles with and without their source information on them, and are part of a legacy collection? There, I think you have to look at what you have. You have to work with what you have, and I don't know if you can tell if there's an original order to those, if they're grouped by subject or if they're grouped chronologically. Try to recreate whatever you have, and then you just explain in your finding aid, this is what we had to work with and this is what we did with it, and so people understand what they're looking for, and that may be the best you can do. Okay, we got through most of the questions. I'm sorry that I think we didn't get through all of them. There were still a few left, but our time is up. So you can always email. My email is here in the presentation, and I'm happy to respond to any questions you may have that I may be able to help you out with. I don't know if Leah, if you had anything else that you wanted to say. Leah did make a comment that all of you who were participants in the webinar will get an email with a link to that YouTube recording of this presentation, so you can access it later. Okay. Okay, hearing nothing else, I think we're done here for today. Thanks everybody for being part of the webinar. I hope it was helpful, and feel free to contact me if I can be of assistance. All right, Have a good day.